is Evelyn Rowe, and we're speaking today with Mrs. Penn in her home in North Battleford. Today is July 18th, 1985. Mrs. Penn, maybe you can tell me a little bit about yourself and where you came from.
I came to Saskatchewan Hospital 25 from Shellbrook, that's where I have been living. And I had trained for 2 years. And because of sickness, I had to discontinue. And I decided that I would like to come to North Battleford and try it. I wasn't happy when I first came. I didn't like it at all. But after a few months, I enjoyed it. And I found it very, very different to what I had ever been used to.
Well, maybe you can tell me a little bit about what you did when you came to North Battleford. Your psychiatric training, or perhaps...
I didn't have any psychiatric training. No one had. There was very few staff. I think on night duty there was 8 staff. Mind you, there was maybe 200 patients, female patients, because we had no part of the male side with male patients.
Why did you choose psychiatric nursing for a career?
Because I had to find something to do. And in those days, you were a nurse, a teacher, or maybe a stenographer, and that was about all you. And it was times were really hard where you didn't have a chance to go to university that easy.
So did you take a course at the Saskatchewan Hospital?
No, never did, because there was nothing. They started their classes in the 30s. And before that, there was no anything that we did. We had to find out our own self.
So you were just hired and placed on the wards then? Mm-hmm. And from there, how did you learn what you were to do?
From the one who was in charge.
So on-the-job experience then?
Yes.
During your years at the hospital, where did you live?
I lived on the hospital grounds. In 30, they had built the apartment block because there was just nothing but shacks along the river. You know where you live. All along that way were shacks when I went there, right up to the end of the cottages. And they were just shacks. And the Liberal government decided that they would build a block and the people would live free and do shacks, which is what happened.
So you lived in these apartment blocks then?
Mm-hmm. Until I retired, moved to town.
I see. And you said it was rent-free?
After the Conservatives went in, they put the rent on. Fired the married people.
And about what was the rent when it first came out?
I think it was around $25 a month, depending on the size of the suite you had. See, because there was 1, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom suites.
Oh, I see. I understand that there was a lot of social activities going on at the hospital.
Yes, we had a lot of social. We had church groups. We had a hospital auxiliary, Red Cross. And during the war, we were all kept very busy.
How about activities like bowling and
No,
curling?
there was badminton and curling. Well, the curling didn't start until in the 40s or late 30s. And balls. They had tennis courts back of the nurses' residence because there wasn't trees. There was just open sort of prairie for wherever you looked.
Did you spend any time in the nurses' residence?
Yes, I spent time from 1925 until 1929.
Could you maybe tell me what it was like living in the residence there?
It was interesting and it was fun. There wasn't that many of us, and we didn't have that much money to spend to do much, but everyone got along well, and there were dances, and there was lots of, and I think oftentimes the people in town resented us maybe as we had.
Did the patients partake in any of the social activities out there?
No, they hadn't. They didn't even have parole or anything. They weren't allowed off the wards.
So the activities the patients had were contained within the hospital?
Yes, they had danced, different things, but not too much. And they were patients, remember, that were, these patients, a lot of them had come from Brandon when they opened the hospital, and they were chronic patients. And also, there was no treatments, no medications.
Oh, I see. So did you visit town a lot for social your time spent out in the hospital?
We visited. We had, friends in town. But at the same time, we didn't need to go to town because we always were things among ourselves. And there was a lot of families living there. And a lot of the people who lived there had big families, first in the block.
So visits to town were few and far between.
Well, that's...
How did the people in town react to the hospital and to the staff when they did go to town?
Well, I think they were fine. At least I never found them any different. And mind you, we had to go into different organizations to represent our organization as an auxiliary out at the hospital, like with the Red Cross and the Hospital Auxiliary and Patriotic Club. And then during the war, we spent a lot of time at the hostel where the RAF were fed and entertained.
I see. Did many people come out and visit the hospital?
Yes. They liked to come out because it was very lovely in those days, with gardens, and the grounds were very lovely, and lawns. And people used to drive around an awful lot.
Did the hospital do a lot of business with the city? For example, were repairs and supplies obtained from town?
Yes. And all the money that was ever made at the hospital went to North Battleford. So the people had to be decent to the people at the hospital. I think that the town people and the districts really enjoyed the hospital people.
Were repairs or supplies gotten from the hospital? Or
Oh, well, you see, we had a store out there at the hospital, and you could requisition all your groceries, our meat, our bread, from the bake shop. You buy your bread tickets, and there was tokens given. So when you went, you gave a token for your bread, and you requisitioned from the store. They also had men's shirts and shoes and linen, towels, and stuff like that in the store. And laundry. They had always very lovely laundry.
Did pretty well anything
you wanted out there.
Did the people of the staff of the hospital do all the repairs themselves? Like if a window was broken?
No, nobody. It was all repaired.
Through the people at the hospital?
Mm-hmm. From their maintenance.
I see. Did the patients leave the hospital at all to go to town?
No.
For any reasons? No? They were...
You see, you would have to remember it was nearly 60 years ago. But after all, these people were not... They were... If they'd been today with medication and the way they socialize today, they didn't do that. And there was a time when there were several patients had parole. that they could go out and walk. But then they took off.
Your work at the hospital, maybe I could have you describe a typical day during your first years of work there.
Well, we started at 7 o'clock in the morning. And there was breakfast and beds to be made up. And the cleaning. We didn't have help to clean. With the help of the patients, we did all the cleaning. And I'm telling you that if the staff today, they'd die. If they had to go through what we had. And at 10 o'clock, we had our lunch. And fresh bread, tea, and syrup. And it amazed me and fascinated me because when I started, the staff used to mix their butter and their syrup together. And it was real good. And we were that way good. And then after our lunch, we went for a walk 2 or 3 times a week. And all the patients went, and the staff, except the ones in charge. And at 1 o'clock, we had dinner. At 1 o'clock, we went down to the sewing room where the patients worked. And everyone who, well, was able, they went and did embroidery work and just everything beautiful. And at 4:30, we came back to the wards. Patients were returned to their ward. Then we prepared supper. And then maybe there'd be a dance at 7 o'clock, or, we'd go and they'd dance for maybe. Patients were never allowed to mix. At the dances, the staff, the male staff danced with the female patients, and the female patients danced with the male patients.
Or was there a central kitchen?
Oh, there was a central kitchen. And there was very few that were fed on to the wards, unless, because there wasn't a hospital ward until 1929, and 1B had been emptied. And it was opened as a hospital ward, and I went there in charge of that hospital ward, and I was there until I retired.
What were some of the methods of treatment used in the early days of your career?
Well, all we had was the prolonged baths, the hydro, and the packs. That was all.
Maybe you could tell me exactly what was involved in each.
Well, the baths. Do you know anything about the baths? They were 6 or 7, just ordinary bathtubs. And there was a hammock put over them where the patient sat, and the water came in the head at a certain temperature at the head of the bath and out the bottom. And over that was a canvas, and all there was their head. It was laced and they were fastened in. And they stayed in there all day in the baths. And then they were taken out and bathed, taken to their ward. Because, well, they had to be kept in a place, something like that, because they just, would wear themselves out. And the hydro was a place where they had it was like a cabinet. And you walked in, and it had huge discs where the water came out. And they were all along this cabinet. And then at the back was a cabinet where you stood, and the water was warm in this, where the discs, or whatever you want to call them. And you stood with a hose, a fine hose, and it was cold water. And went up and down their backs for a few minutes. And it really helped a lot of those people, and they asked for hydro, and they asked for baths if they felt they were really disturbed. And the packs were, well, they were on a narrow bed, and they were wrapped straight, with their arms straight down, into wet, cold sheets. And then they were wrapped in wool blankets, and they were fastened there. That's the way they were kept, and ice packs on their heads. And they were kept there all day, and they were taken out and bathed, taken back to their wards at night. They were fed in there and everything.
Were these methods really effective?
Yes, I think they were, because a lot of people who, not only were they mentally ill, but they had a lot of things that were, like several patients who were brought in, they'd had surgery, and they wouldn't keep dressings or nothing. So they were kept in the baths, and that was a real healing effect. And I think it was a restful, for them too.
The farming aspect of the community, that was and also a form of treatment for some patients.
Well, you see, all the patients worked if they were able. And on the farm, all these people worked, the men. They had their sheep. There was men who took care of the sheep, and men who took care of the barns and the horses, because they used horses for everything. And they didn't have tractors and cars and trucks and what have you. So, and then Ernie Hall, he had the chicken farm where they raised all kinds of chickens and pigs. You know where that is?
No.
Oh, it was just a couple of miles, east of the hospital. Well, not 2 miles, maybe.
So the farm was quite self-sufficient for the
Oh,
hospital?
yes, and then with their gardens. So, I mean, they used their gardens to feed a lot of these people, too.
So the farming and the work was very important to the patients out there?
Well, yes, because after all, so many of those patients had been farmers, and they felt that, well, it was just like their own farm. In fact, several times one of the men went over and sold his horses and Belford. After all, they were his.
And what happened, do you think? How did the patients feel when they sold the farm, or when the farming was quit?
It was something that, it was sort of taking something away from them. Because after all, you put a person that had been used to working always, and getting up at a certain time, and taking care and doing these things, and then not to have it, because they didn't know anything else.
So it was a great loss to them?
Well, I think so. All of it was.
So who took part then in the operations of the farm?
Well, they had the farm, had a farmer. He was a university. In fact, Ram Moore was there for years and years. And then they had a big herd of Holstein cattle. And they always, we had all the milk we wanted, and I think they maybe sold milk, I'm not sure. But they went in for purebred Holsteins. They sold a lot of them. And they always, at the exhibition, they had them for years and years on display there.
And it was male staff, or male patients?
Male patients. And mind you, they had people in charge. So.
Who were some of the doctors at the hospital at that time?
Well, when I went there, there was Dr. McNeil, who was the superintendent, and Dr. Nelson, the assistant, and Dr. Salmon. And then later on, Dr. Cameron came. And during the summer, we had med students from university that would spend their summer there.
And maybe you could tell me a bit about Dr. McNeil. What type of fellow he was?
Well, to me, he was a real wonderful man. Now, not everybody will agree with me because he had a real temper in a way, and he'd yell. But he'd just turn over in his grave and he knew all the things that happened out there that he had worked so hard for.
So he was really directly involved with the workings of the hospital.
Yes. And he knew all the staff and every patient and everything. And he'd walk along through those wards with his head down, and you wouldn't think he'd have known or seen anything. And boy, he didn't miss a thing. I thought he was a real wonderful man.
So all in all, there was quite a competent staff out there.
Oh, I think so, yes.
You became head of a ward. You became head nurse.
Mm-hmm.
When did that
Not a
happen?
head nurse, it was supervisor, because there was only one head nurse.
And what was the head nurse's job?
Well, she arranged for the listing of where you worked and what have you.
And your job as supervisor? What did you do as a supervisor?
I opened up 1B as a supervisor. But now, mind you, nobody knows too much, but I got paid for supervisor's pay not long after I had been there, because I was sent to work in every department. The only place that I was no good at was the laundry. I only went one day.
So were your duties changed then when you became supervisor from your regular daytime duties? Like,
Yes.
what were your responsibilities?
You were on day steady, and you were in charge of, like the hospital ward, where you had these people in bed, and you were responsible for pretty well everything.
So did you prefer being a supervisor then?
Yes.
What do you feel that some of the main changes which have taken place over the years in terms of responsibilities of psychiatric nurses, from what you were expected to do when you first started to what's being
I don't
expected
think that you could even compare them.
now? Why is that?
Well, because they were so different. I mean, when I went back to work in 49, and I worked in the dietary staff then. And I could have taken lectures, but I felt it wasn't worth it at my age. And I wanted to do something because I wasn't doing a thing except doing for other people and taking care of their youngsters. And I found there was such a difference in everything, which was good. But there was a different class of patients, and also there was medication, because all they'd have to do is hand out their medication, and that was that. Where we would have to struggle with, you have no idea how, we had to struggle with people, always. And they'd bring them in, and you struggled with them.
Maybe you could give me an example of something like that.
Well, I remember taking a patient in one night. You see, they used to bring them on the train. They'd have an escort that would bring them in. And this patient was, well, she had handcuffs and that because, and the one who brought her in, her uniform was just torn right down the front. We couldn't handle her. We had to get a couple of the men in to help bath her. And there was nothing to give them. Today they can give them medication and needles and that quiet them right down, but there wasn't a thing in those days.
So how did you go about
Controlling them.
or bringing her?
Well, we got her Beth and got her into bed, and they got her into a room, and you didn't go in unless there was 2 or 3 went in with you. And it was too bad because in those days, you see, the people had to pay. And many times when these farmers that had been in there for years, they'd lost everything. And they didn't bring them in until they needed help so badly.
So the job was sort of risky then in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it was.
A lot of confrontations with patients. Any other changes that you found when you returned?
Oh, there were so many. You wouldn't have known it was the same place.
Had your responsibilities as a nurse changed? If things you were expected to do?
Well, yes, because they had help for every department pretty well. I mean, they didn't have to go cleaning and taking care of, and if a patient didn't want to do anything, it was okay. They didn't have to. They could sit.
So a lot less burden on the nurses then?
Well, yes, it certainly was. And then they had a lot of time off where we didn't get time off. We had a day, maybe a week.
How do you feel about the closing of institutions like the hospital now, things that are happening nowadays? Do you think there's a need for hospitals like the Saskatchewan
Yes, I do. I think there's a need. And I don't go for these boarding out places and that, because I think a lot of the people who are in these places are unhappy. Whereas at the hospital, there was groups and they were entertained and everything in the, this last years.
So you feel there's a real need there?
I think so, and there'll always be. If they didn't have their medication today, that hospital would be full.
So medication, when it came about, that changed your job quite a bit.
Well, yes.
How did it made it easier, you feel?
Well, of course it did, because after all, you didn't have the struggling and all that of these people. And your own dad will tell you that. Now, mind you, I don't know whether when he started to work there, they didn't have medication like they have today.
So the change in medication was...
Well, yes. And after all, I know a lot of these people, if they miss or don't have their medication, they need to be taken care of. Because I have one right here across the tracks that come, and every once in a while she comes roaring in here, and I have to phone the community nurse.
So do you feel, though, that they should maybe have continued on with some of the old methods of treatment, even with the new medications?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that was a thing of the past, and that was all that they had. I think it's a good thing, these people to have medication. But they have to stay on it, I think, all their lives.
So altogether, how many years did you work at the hospital?
Well, I went there in 25, and I retired in 30. And I went back in 49, and I retired in 69.
Why did you leave the hospital in 1930?
That's when we were laid off.
Why was that?
Because the conservatives came in, and it was the Depression time, and they let the married women all out. It was a good thing, because I think most of us were pregnant.
So you worked there for many years then?
And I'd lived there all my years. And I don't think that if I had my life to live over, I would have wanted it any different.
You really enjoyed your years?
I really enjoyed it, and I met, there were so many nice patients, and you learned an awful lot, and a lot of nice staff. because I've got still staff that I'm still friendly with after all these years. In fact, I had staff the other day that I was friendly with when I went to work in 25.
So relationships that's lasted over the years.
Yes.